Frank, you're not muted, just so you know.
Okay, should I mute myself?
Probably a good idea.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening from Miami, that is. Welcome to Journalism in a Polarized Pandemic, a webinar that organized by Funda Medios and the University of Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas. I'm Sally Hughes. I'm a faculty director at the Institute and also the Associate Dean for Global Initiatives at the University of Miami School of Communication. Along with the students in our Latin American Journalism and Media Systems class, I want to thank a stellar group of panelists for the work they're doing every day and for joining us this evening to tell us about that work. Among the lessons the COVID-19 pandemic has reaffirmed is that journalism, based on the verification of information and presented in the public interest, is more important than ever. Until an effective vaccine is made accessible around the world, the best medicine against COVID-19 is reliable information. That information, of course, is produced by scientists, and governments should use it to support the public health. Journalists, meanwhile, play equally vital roles. They verify the authenticity of health information and then customize and disseminate it to specific communities. This has required a great deal of learning and adaptation. Journalists also play a more familiar role during this pandemic, which is one of monitoring government and others in power. But they're doing so in a context marked not only by health risk, but also a polarized political scenario that further complicates their work. We'll hear today about how journalists verify, contextualize, and disseminate reliable health information within a context shaped by challenges that predate COVID-19, but continue to complicate their work. The first is a technology-driven economic transition that has, in the aggregate, slashed resources for local news production and opened even more ways to spread disinformation. The second is a post-truth epistemology that rejects empirically based knowledge, whether from science or journalism, in favor of emotionally appealing rhetoric from politicians and confirmatory interest groups. And the third challenge is a hostile environment for journalists whose work contradicts partisans and who tend to be more viciously attacked because of their personal gender, racial, and religious identities. But along with these challenges, adaptation and resilience also mark and predate the period prior to the pandemic. Collaborative, investigative, and sometimes nonprofit journalism in Brazil, Puerto Rico, and the mainland United States have exposed corruption, cruelty, and ineptitude with a consistency that harkens to a new golden era of public service journalism that could in turn strengthen democratic corrective mechanisms. The professional identity of public interest journalists has driven them to organize beyond their individual newsrooms to safeguard their well-being and to improve their investigative capacity. So this was the scenario for journalism as the coronavirus spread around the world. Today, we'll hear from journalists across the Americas about how they continue to navigate these crosswinds. Joining us from Brazil, Cristina Zahar is the executive director of the prestigious Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalism, or ABRAJI. She will share experiences in a country that trails only the United States in coronavirus cases and only the US and India in coronavirus-related deaths. Also similarly to the United States, the work of journalists in Brazil is complicated by the behavior of a president and his supporters who engage in stigmatizing verbal attacks and who expose journalists' personal information online sometimes provoking mom-based response. Sandra Rodriguez Cueto is a well-known radio journalist with decades of experience in Puerto Rico and beyond. She wrote a book about her experiences covering the aftermath of Hurricane Maria on the only station that continued on the air for weeks, Guapa Radio. Along with journalist Rafeli Gonzalez, Rodriguez Cotto has filed a First Amendment challenge against two recent fake news laws in Puerto Rico that threaten to criminalize critical reporting just when we need it the most. Andrea Forcada Fraile also joins us. She is the editor of Que Pasa newspaper in North Carolina. Que Pasa serves a community where disparities in access to quality healthcare and quality information, as well as stigmatizing discourse and dangerous immigration policies, greatly accentuate their risk. Serving their readers has required learning, creativity, and tenacity. To provide a wider panorama, we're really fortunate to have with us Frank LaRue, who is Funda Medio's human rights and legal advisor. LaRue has a long history as a human rights defender in Guatemala, the US, and Europe. Among other important roles he's held internationally, LaRue is the former UN Special Rapporteur for the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. So, to start this conversation, I would like to ask the panelists to take 5 or 7 minutes to explain the situation they and their colleagues are facing. We'll then have plenty of time for conversation and invite you to ask questions through the Q&A mechanism. So let's start with Christina, sorry. Let's start with Christina and go from south to north. Christina, what are the priorities of you and your colleagues during the pandemic? What are the challenges you are facing and how are you facing them? Please, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Sally, and thanks for having me tonight. When we first heard from the new coronavirus arriving in Brazil was just after Carnival, at the end of February. I remember the first cases were imported, people who has traveled abroad for business or vacation. In the beginning of March, 2 staff traveled for business purposes. One to attend the IRE conference in New Orleans, and the other one to the Inter-American Commission Human Rights audience in Haiti. We didn't have much information at that time about the pandemic. When they both came back, I asked them to test, and they stayed quarantined at home. All the staff started to work from home on March 11, and we are still doing so. Maybe in January you can come back, but if there is no vaccine, we are not going back. As the pandemic started spreading, so had the online harassment against journalists. President Bolsonaro and his followers started attacking more and more often media outlets and journalists themselves. So Abrage had to issue more and more repudiation notes, such as in the case of Patricia Campos Melo, the reporter from Folha de São Paulo who won the Maria Moores Cabot Prize this year. We have also been involved in the discussions around the bill to regulate disinformation. Abrage and civil society asked for more time to discuss it instead of trying to approve it in a hurry during the pandemic. Another important task we have embraced was fighting against FOIA restrictions by federal government, who tried, for instance, to use the pandemic as an excuse to delay the deadlines for responding to requests made in use the FOIA in Brazil. So this is how we are fighting all this situation in Brazil.
Sounds like you have challenges on many fronts. Let's turn now to Sandra Rodriguez Cotto in Puerto Rico. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for the invitation. I'm really honored to be with this panel of such distinguished colleagues and journalists all over the world. Basically, we have been experiencing more or less what Christina is saying, and I think journalists across the globe are experiencing the same. Lack of information, We need more details about what is really going on, the measures that are taking the different governments to deal with this situation. But in Puerto Rico, we're experiencing differently, a little bit differently, in the sense that we have been basically coming out of a couple of tragedies and environmental situations. We had two big hurricanes that nearly destroyed the island, particularly Hurricane Irma in 2017, then Hurricane Maria. After that, we had the general protest against the government, and the governor had to resign because of a public opposition. So we had in a period of less than a week, we had 3 different governors. So it was a political unrest, and that environment involves a lot of problems for the job of a real journalist that needs to get information, and there is a lack of transparency as an institutionalized way of handling the government. They're not given information. Journalists have to go and sue the government at court in order to get information. And also you have harassment from political opponents, and particularly cyber harassment on social media by political fans. And then right after what happened during last summer, that we worked during uncovering Telegram chat between the then governor and his aides that were basically mocking the citizens and making fun of the people that died during the hurricane. And President Trump came and threw paper towels at us. We were going back to normal after a political upheaval that we had 3 different governors, as I mentioned. And then a series of earthquakes hit the island. So we have been going back and forth in terms of rebuilding the island. And all of a sudden, this pandemic. We started a shutdown on March 15. So far, there are about 800 people that have died so far, but we have about over 50,000 people that have been infected. There has been a lot of problems in covering this situation. We don't have access to information. Government is not being transparent, as I mentioned, and there's a lot of corruption cases. Just to give you an example, at the beginning of the lockdown, I found out that someone at the government, at the health department, was going to buy 500 tests for COVID-19, the first set of tests to test the citizen, and that disappeared. And all of a sudden, when I published that story, it became a news. And when politicians got involved and people started to ask questions, then they found out that they were going to buy those 500 tests out of a construction company for almost $40 million. So it was a corruption scheme that is still being investigated by the legislature. So in that environment of lack of information, the journalists have to deal with that. We're also working closely remotely, as most of the people are, using the Zoom and using technologies. Government agencies, they tend to open and shut down. And now in 2 weeks, we're going to have elections. So we're dealing with that. We're dealing with some people getting sick. There have been politicians getting sick, and even journalists and their relatives as well. So adding to that challenge, we have the challenge of the entire environment against freedom of information, freedom of speech, and more important, freedom of the press. So that's more or less what we're going through in Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Sandra. I'd like to hear from all of you in a few minutes, the steps you're taking on the job as you report to stay safe. It sounds like all of you are have many challenges that are just layered on top of probably the most important, which is keeping yourself safe as you seek that information. So thank you for that. Andrea, how are things in North Carolina? Perhaps you could tell us a bit about your publication as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sally, for inviting me and inviting Que Pasa to participate in this tonight in this talk. So let me start a little bit to talking about what is ¿Qué pasa? To understand what I'm going to say later about the challenges that we've been facing. ¿Qué pasa? Is a small newspaper, relatively small. We are based in North Carolina. We have 3 main printing editions in the main cities in the state, Raleigh, Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Greensboro. And we cover news, local news, focused for the Latino Hispanic community in the state. Our readers are mostly first generation immigrants coming from Central and Latin America, whose first language is Spanish. So that brings me to the first challenge that we've been facing since the very beginning of the pandemic, which has been the lack of Spanish information available from the institutions, from the local organizations. We've been encountering like a different, so we were receiving a lot of information from the CDCs, from the governments, but all this information was not only difficult to understand, but also was in English, and we had to manage to convert that information into very, explain in a simple way to be able to inform a community that at the beginning was very, was not trusting about the virus, a community that, because there was no information directly appointed to them, they were not taking the virus seriously. So one of our challenges was not only informing in Spanish, but also trying to make that distrust, trying to make the community trust this virus, and because it's been a dangerous virus. It's been a virus that has, right now in North Carolina, there are about 51,000 Latino people infected. So yeah, not only that, but also together with the lack of Spanish information, which meant that the community was relying on Spanish media to learn about the virus, there was the lack of data. At the beginning of the pandemic, numbers were very, very general. We were hearing about cases, we were hearing about North Carolina as a whole, but we didn't know how many Hispanic people were being infected. And we're talking about a community that they work in essential jobs. They work in the construction, they work in the fields, in agriculture, they work in processing plants. And all those jobs, the risk of getting infected was really high. And we knew that there were a lot of people in the community that were getting infected, but we couldn't find those numbers. We couldn't inform about it because we didn't have information. So, for example, in ¿Qué pasa? We started digging into this issue, and we published news about the lack of information and how important it was to have data like divided into ethnicities, into races, to really know how, like, the level of impact of the virus. Luckily, now the government in North Carolina has divided, is publishing data by ages, by races, by ethnicity, which is allowing us to really have proper information. Another, very quickly, another of the challenges that we were facing is the Latino community, especially our readers and our audience, they are people that are not used to using technologies. So by the time that we jump into a world where we only use the technology, we rely a lot on Zoom, on apps, on always being with the email. Everything was informed by email, by the screen. We have a community that because the work that they have, because the way they live, they don't use the technology as much. So we had to come with creative ideas to get that information to make them being informed, but also aware and educated about the virus, um, with things like simple publications, like simple dossiers that we were distributing, flyers, using a lot Facebook, because we found out that is the main sort of communication among the community in North Carolina. So we had to a little bit reinvent the way we were communicating, the way we were informing, in order to reach the majority of the community, to make them see that this virus was really impacting, and yeah, and they had to take it seriously.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. I know that the Hispanic community in the US is very diverse, but there are sectors of it that are very much exposed to risk for many of for the reasons you just enumerated, right? The work they do, the lack of information. So thank you for that overview. I want to turn to Frank, also to remind everybody to put themselves on mute when they're done speaking. Frank, I think you're in a really good position to give us a panoramic view of the Americas, as well as respond to what you've heard. And I would also like to invite you to bring the United States more broadly into this discussion, because I know just a week ago you were before the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, talking about the situation of free expression in the United States during our protests in favor of racial justice. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sally. And yes, I will. Let me begin by saying that it's a big pleasure and an honor to be in this wonderful joint initiative between the University of Miami and Fundamedios, and I'm so pleased. Thank you. I would emphasize that there are four main topics that I would like to mention as challenges to journalism. And you are right in saying that the challenges are diverse, from the pandemic, but also to the secondary effects of the pandemic. Let me begin with number one, is that journalism was already in somewhat of an economic crisis, at least traditional journalism in a way. We saw the constriction of written newspapers because now you have electronic alternatives and you have electronic media. And although we all believe that internet is a wonderful development and it democratizes communication, in the case of journalists, it clearly set journalism in a complicated path of learning new technologies on one side, but of also going into somewhat of an economic crisis of sustainability for traditional media and traditional journalism. Of course, one could always argue that this opened the door for new forms of journalism, and the amount of online journals and online magazines and investigative journalism has developed, and this is true. But the question is the sustainability. And I just want to leave that there, but the pandemic came and made this much more serious. The pandemic, of course, has affected the economy of the entire countries, and the journalism and the media is not excluded. So one issue that we have to look at is that it was already difficult to find sustainability, and it is much more difficult now under the pandemic. Number two, and this goes a lot into the example of Andrea in North Carolina, we discovered how important information is. One of the issues why, one of the clear numbers that she mentioned to us as from the medios before, is that although the Latino population in North Carolina represent 19% of the population, almost 20%, but in terms of contagion, it was 4 times the percentage of COVID people of infected individuals than white population. Why the difference? Partly because of the type of work, as Andrea was mentioning. A Latino population did not stop working, and they worked in agriculture, meat packing, or in basic services that kept on going. But the other reason was the lack of information. And here I think we discovered something new, which is important to point as a lesson, is that news has to be relevant to the local level, to the community. Normally we can see national networks that will give you the national number of infections or the national number of people deceased because of COVID, which is important. I'm not saying that, but it doesn't solve the needs of a local community, of how high is the infection rate locally, how serious is it, should they quarantine more strictly, where do they find the nearest health service, or where are the county programs or state programs to look at. So the information that they need is so locally relevant that it made us look into that. There has to be local relevant information, which also has to be culturally appropriate, has to be in their language, in their culture, in their tradition, to be able to go through. And this is something that the pandemic has really taught us in terms of all ethnic groups and minorities throughout the states. The third phenomenon is very tragic, is that in a pandemic, it brought out the authoritarian nature of many governments, from people like Bolsonaro in Brazil to all the way to President Trump in Washington, in the sense that there's always a feeling that you can make decisions on your own. So one of the first things we saw is that there was a lack of will to make it very transparent. In many governments were afraid to let people know how big the pandemic was, how serious the infection disease was, and the average of infectiousness in a country. So there was always difficult, and this we found that in all Latin America, but it was also clear in the US at the beginning, when the administration was trying to give the false idea that, no, this is going to go by like a big cold, it's going to be somewhat like the winter colds that we always have, and wait a little second, is getting better. There was always the effort to make a rosy picture of something that was so serious and needed serious information. Now, I'm not saying that the information should dramatize what should not be dramatized, but people need and have the right to receive scientific, true, and valid information, especially in a pandemic. That did not come through. And when the requests were made to the authorities, they were not willing to give it. So we found a lack of information. And in some countries in Latin America, where there were states of emergency or states of siege because of the pandemic, the information, in general information of state activity, was even reduced. So there was a response with a closing of information and a lack of information on a public nature. And the fourth, which is probably the most serious one, is that authoritarian attitude of many governments, combined, which was already the attitude of leaders that were not very happy, especially populist leaders, conservative leaders, that were not very happy by being criticized by the press. And they began to clamp down. And here, these populist leaders from the right or the left, by the way, because you can see it in Bolsonaro of Brazil, like you can see it in Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, or in Maduro in Venezuela, or in Donald Trump in Washington. All of them reacted the same way. The pandemic was the great chance to have a harsher rhetoric, to have what's called in human rights circles of freedom of expression, what's called dangerous language. It's not hate speech per se, but it's dangerous language because it's an aggressive language. It's trying to disqualify people, calling the press the enemies of the state, enemies of democracy, fake news, those that are confusing the population, those are conspiracy theories, all the adjectives you could use to name the press. But what they were really creating was a sense of verbal harassment, I would call it, against journalism, because they were trying to disqualify and discredit them, journalists as individuals. And this provokes an attitude of aggression that we saw repeated during the demonstrations in the US, as you were asking at the beginning. This was the basis of our hearing before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. It was surprising that the United States, with the First Amendment, which is the constitutional legislation, was the highest level of freedom of expression around the world, and with the tradition of being the example of a free press, an example that the US likes to promote and to show, rightfully so, became the country where no matter in what city, whether it was in Seattle or it was in in Portland, Oregon, or whether it was in New York or in Chicago or in Minnesota, no matter where it was, the law enforcement agents conducted themselves in the same aggressive way. And when I mean aggressive, it's physically aggressive. Journalists were being arrested arbitrarily, were being pushed around. We have the case of Linda Tirado, who lost her vision in one eye because of a rubber bullet shot directly at her face. We saw this attitude, and what was so surprising is that all was done by different police forces around the country. They were all from different cities and from different states. And in some cases, there were city police, in some cases, there were state police, and in some cases, there were federal agents. But they all acted the same way. They saw the journalists as troublemakers that they had to tackle. And this is what they did. They literally went out to tackle journalists. This had never happened in the US and should never happen again. These are like the four big symptoms, I think, that we got out of the pandemic. And probably one of the most serious reactions is here in the United States. And this should be a collective reflection of a country that has so strongly defended freedom of expression and freedom of the press.
Thank you for that, Frank. That was a really insightful overview. It's interesting that at the time when we see that information is more important than ever, and actually, at least in the US, the seeking of information became much more intense during the pandemic. Of course it did. It's also a time where the sustainability of journalism is more greatly questioned, right? Because of the financial, the transition in the business model we were talking about. So that's definitely, to me, one of the big question marks that we'll have looking forward about when we think about what journalism will be in 3 to 5 years, given this experience. On the other hand, just reacting to what you said, this authoritarian tendency of governments at a time when they need to talk to their populations, right? They need to work with journalists and others to translate information to the local level, to different communities. It's striking that in so many of our countries, what we've seen is instead of trying to work with journalists, there's been attempts to shut journalism down. Considering all of this and all the work you're doing, I before we jump to the questions, and I'm glad there are many, what do you think journalism, assuming that we have a vaccine and it is circulated by this time next year, what do you think journalism will be like? What will journalism take away that is helpful and problematic over the next 3 to 5 years? This is potentially, this is a far-reaching experience that journalism is going through. So I wonder if I could ask you, either based on your organizations and your publications, or more broadly, your countries and contexts. And this time maybe we can start in the north, and we'll go to Andrea first, and then Sandra, and then Christina, and then Frank. Andrea.
Yes, thank you, Sally. Yeah, I think as Frank was mentioning, like journalism has been in crisis like way before the pandemic, and somehow it has managed to survive, struggling, but to survive. I think talking more, focusing more in the local journalism, in local publications, I think I would like to see in 5 years more. What I think is like I would like to see that local publications have gained they are more reliable. Like, sorry, readers rely more on local publications because, for example, in our case, it's clear that the information like was coming from this local state media more than like the Trump administration, the agencies. So what I think is in few years, it should, local publications should be more like, the community should rely more on these publications. I've also seen like, as well as this pandemic has created a huge crisis and has like publications like ours, for example, have been struggling with very few staff, few resources. I've also seen on the other hand that there's been an opportunity for new media to born, new publications, new local projects. On one side, because of the need of more information, even though we've been like buried in information from all sides. So I would like to see a like local journalism evolve, and taking into account from the institutions, from the governments, like I would like to see more journalists, like more local publications being on front of the line. So in press conference from the governors, from the administrations, because at the end of the day, is the local journalism that focus more on what is going on in our neighborhoods, in our cities, and is what is focusing more on what is going on with our communities, right? So yeah, crisis is gonna keep going, and hopefully we don't have a like the newspapers, the local radios don't disappear, which unfortunately some have closed already.
Thank you. Certainly in times of crisis, be it hurricanes or now a health crisis, we need locally contextualized information, right? In Miami, as you might imagine, our local public officials give press conferences in English, Spanish, and Creole, but that is not the case in the rest of the United States, and hopefully that will change. But my guess is there needs to be advocacy to get it to change. So thanks for that observation. Sandra, what are your thoughts? Puerto Rico has seen its population decline. As you mentioned, it's had numerous environmental and man-made disasters. How do you think journalism in Puerto Rico will come out of this, both in terms of possible strengthening, in terms of credibility, for example, and problems that we should be aware of?
As I said, I do think we are having and experiencing the same as in other places in the world. Journalists are under fire, as Frank mentioned, from authoritarian governments as well. So journalism in general is facing a bit, I think, one of the biggest challenges in its recent history, and not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the economic conditions involving this situation. We have to take into consideration, for example, that not only in the States and in Europe and Latin America, we have seen that in Puerto Rico as well, the lack of funding, more competition, and also an increase of what it's been called the citizenship journalist or journalism, or people that basically go to the social media and present information and get confused with a traditional journalism. In my experience, I can tell you what I've been doing. I've been doing both. I've been using my social media as a platform to inform, also to get my opinions and to provide my how I see of what I'm seeing during my reporting. And also I use my online publications and also on radio. It has to be a combination. I do, but I agree with Andrea that local journalism is going to be a key in the development of this situation. But because when we compare that to what is going on with the biggest companies throughout the world, all of them are losing money. Some of the governments have had to basically bail out some of those media organizations. They have done it in Spain. They have done it also in Puerto Rico, for example, with when the pandemic started. Most of the companies received some incentives, economic incentives. And just to give you an example, the largest newspaper on the island, what is called the Record newspaper, the biggest one, right after they got the aid from the federal government, they fired reporters. So they're all using the money to save their operations, and then they have to lay off the employees. The same experience has been, you can see that in the Dominican Republic, you can see it in Mexico. I was just talking to some friends that are now turning into social media, particularly YouTube, to become YouTubers, to provide information in YouTube and also on Facebook to report on those platforms. However, there's still a challenge there. I would say that journalism has been in free fall since the internet came. It has changed the way the media is, from what I've seen. For example, when I started way back in Miami 20 years ago on Hispanic TV, and how advertisers were the main source of income for the companies in order to hire reporters, that has changed. Now the algorithms are basically selecting what and how they can focus in attracting and getting their potential customers. So they don't need the media to advertise. So that's one thing. And we're going back to an era where journalists are going back to become lower and even lower working class personnel. And also, I like to add that we have to acknowledge in the near future, and I think it's happening right now, it's gonna happen in the near future, that there's also these social media and internet sites are being censoring the information that is also going out. Just to give you an example, Google and Facebook are telling people, and they're selecting which type of information they're going to hide and which one are going to be prioritized. Just to give you an example, YouTube is asking to put disclaimers on state news and those stories of conspiracy theories, particularly during this pandemic, that have basically proliferated among the social media, but they're not doing that on corporate news. So we have to fight against that in order to do a correct journalist, to provide information. And this and also the hoax of fake news is used, particularly by governments, to delete genuine news, to delete and to discredit genuine information, and also to ban opposing points of view, which is one of the pillars of journalism and democracy, to have a variety of opposing points of view. And you see that not only on the liberal side, but also on the conservative side. And I do think that journalism, straightforward journalism, investigative journalism, and most important, independent journalism is gonna be harder, but it's gonna be the only field that will save this profession, whether it is at a local level, or is it a small local news media outlet, or is using the internet. I do think investigative independent journalism is what going to be the difference between what we do and what other people that are providing information are doing on the media.
Right. I know that some of the main political stories in Puerto Rico and in the US on immigration have come from nonprofit investigative centers working collaboratively with others.
Well, I'm an independent journalist, and that's how I got the chat, the Telegram chat, and I published it on my blog. That's how it started. And then
Right.
the Center for Investigative Journalism published the part of the document, then I published the rest, and it started a political, political, protest on the island. And it started not through traditional media, but within my blog and my radio program, and then on the journalism center.
So independent entrepreneurial journalism, we're seeing more and more projects try to be nonprofit with alternative forms of financing. They have not yet grown to the intensity of covering the entire US, but they're in every country of Latin America, and they're in the US, and they're doing important work. So so much we could talk about there. I want to hear about your lawsuit at some point as well, but let's turn to Christina. Christina, maybe you could also tell the audience a bit about the work that Abraji does, and then looking forward, how do you think your work will change in the next few years because of coronavirus?
Well, Abraji is 18 years old already, so we've seen a lot during all these years. But I really can tell you that 2020 has been the most challenging year we ever had. I started working at Abraji 2 years ago, but it seems I have worked there for all my life. It's so intense, and during this year, it's more intense. One of the things we do is monitor violence against journalists. And we do that since the 2013 riots against Dilma Rousseff's government. But for the past 2 years, we felt a big change from physical attacks to online harassment. So this year's monitoring shows so far 270 attacks against journalists and media outlets in Brazil, more than the double registered in 2019. So what we see, most of the cases are of stigmatizing speech, only attacks made by public authorities against journalists. So 36% of the attacks of these 270 attacks that I mentioned before were made by public authorities. So we have to fight that all the time. And I think the work of Abraji, making reports and publicizing all this is very important. And as I mentioned before, we had the case of Patricia Campos Melo. She works for Folha de São Paulo, and since February, she is a victim of thousands of memes have been circulating on the internet with her face in pornographic montages, calling her a prostitute, making allusion to sexual organs. And until today, she receives messages from people saying that she offers sex in exchange for reports. And some of these asks for her to be raped. So the situation against journalists in Brazil, and particularly against women, is very serious. And when you think the president of Brazil, his sons and his followers, they feel empowered to do that more often, we feel helpless sometimes, but we think we must stand for all journalists. So we will go on with our fight. And there is also another component against the Black journalists. We had a case with Pedro Borges. He is co-founder of Alma Preta, Black Soul in English. It's a news agency that covers racial issues in Brazil. So the president of a public agency, whose mission is to promote and value Black culture, called him a racialist, victimistic, segregationist, anti-white defender of bandits. So when we hear similar stuff almost every day, we think that we must bear with other organizations, human rights organizations in Brazil, to fight against that. Because we cannot naturalize that and think this is usual or normal. Well, apart from that, we also have one project that is called Control X, a database that we created that gathers lawsuits from all over Brazil that ask for content withdrawal, meaning that if a politician or a public authority is not happy with a news that has been published, he or she goes to justice and asks for the content to be removed. This is very common in Brazil. Since the beginning of Control X, we have more than 5,000 lawsuits in our database. So this is another way of intimidating journalists and the press in Brazil. We are facing also cases of censorship. For instance, Global Television, which is the biggest broadcast channel in Brazil, was forbidden to broadcast reports about Senator Flávio Bolsonaro, which he's involved with the case of corruption. And the Global Television was forbidden to talk about it by justice. So this is another form that we are facing more and more often in Brazil. And the government also used an old bill from the dictatorship called National Security Bill. And it's using it against journalists and cartoonists. So last Saturday, I was in the jury of Vladimir Herzog Prize. Is the most prestigious journalism prize in Brazil. And this cartoonist, he's being sued by the Ministry of Justice of Brazil using this law, this bill that I mentioned. And he got the prize along with 109 artists who worked on his same idea to fight against this. So we have these attacks, online harassment. We have legal pressure against journalists. There is another example, a public attorney from the Operation Lava Jato. He's suing a columnist of Folha de São Paulo using a special civil court that was created at its origin to ease access to justice to those who cannot pay. But certainly this guy can pay, but he's using this special civil court because if he wins, the journalist, he can only make an appeal to the Supreme Court. So this is a very unfair way of doing things, but it's happening. There is a case of a writer. He is suffering 80 lawsuits for moral damages in 19 different states of Brazil. So imagine Brazil, how big the country is, and he has to go to each state to defend himself. And this scheme, I can call that a scheme, is promoted by pastors of the Universal Church. So the more you think about what's happening in Brazil, the more I think Abrage's work is more relevant and more important. So going to the second part of your question, I would say that the future of journalism, journalism will always be there because we are the watchdog of the state, and whether they like it or not, we will be there. I don't know, maybe the legacy media will not be there, but independent journalism will be there, investigative journalism will be there. Abrage and other human rights organizations that fight for freedom of expression and press freedom will be there as well. What I think that journalism is facing now is a crisis of business model. So I think that no one has this, it's not the silver bullet. No one has the silver bullet to answer this question. But if you think people can live without a professional journalism, I don't think so. Because if you just read the messages from your WhatsApp that your aunt or your uncle sent you, you just have a lot of misinformation. You will not be informed. So you need professional journalism. So how can journalism survive? It must find different ways of being sustainable. Crowdsourcing, freemium models, paywall, and organizing events, conferences, and other ways of making money. So it's not easy, and I'm not saying it's easy, but because I come from legacy media. I worked my whole life on the print, so I know how hard it is, but you have to try. And I have an example. The Wall, it's a news portal that is turning 25, I think, this year. And they can offer news for free. Why? Because one of its business is to sell those payment machines that you put your credit card, or you just have your cell phone and you can pay. So this allows that Wall can offer news for free. So I think it's gonna be very difficult to find these new business models for journalism. But I think this information is doing us a favor, because if we want to fight this information, like Abrage is doing with the project Comprova, we need journalism. So we need the verifying agencies. We need IFCN. And also we need media literacy to form a new generation of critical readers. That's it. That's what I think. I think we have a future.
Yeah, it was very, very thorough, and I really appreciated the overview. My thoughts about the business model. Some journalist organizations like yours that are now entering their second decade, but others are new. And I think one of the heartening developments for me in the last few years is how journalists are organizing independently for collaborative work, for protection. Instead of trying to Frank, but maybe he could take the first attempt at answering this question, since we're moving along in time. And where is it now that I've lost it? We have a lot of questions. Here it is. This is from Parker Gimbel, one of our students here at the University of Miami. And he asked Andrea, but to be honest, I think this is key for many of the dilemmas that you all are facing. The question is, how can publications reassert their integrity in the view of people who have been swayed by leaders like Trump or Bolsonaro declaring authentic media outlets as fake news? So that gets the issue of credibility, which would support both the business model and the attempts to end impunity and lower the attacks on the press. So just to restate it, how can publications or national press reassert their integrity in the view of people that have been swayed by leaders and others who call them fake news? Frank, if you want to start, and then we'll go around.
Sure, Sally. Well, it actually goes exactly to one of the topics I wanted to mention about the future of journalism. It's not so much to reassert integrity as it is to reassert credibility, because what these leaders are doing are trying to erode the credibility. I think the integrity is there. I think journalists are doing their best. But what these leaders that do not want to be criticized are trying to do is to erode that. But I think we're coming around a bend with this pandemic and with the attitude of these leaders. People forget that when journalism is practiced in a professional and independent way, is not only the exercise of freedom of research, freedom of thought, and freedom of expression by journalists, but is more importantly, the way in which journalists are facilitating the exercise of access to information by all society. And without access to information, there is no democracy. So in reality, as criticized as journalism may be, it is a necessary profession for any democracy, because you cannot have democracy without precisely that degree of pluralism. And this is the solution. The more the journalism demonstrates that it is truly independent, not only from governments and political interests, but even also from economic interests. I mean, the fact that you live off advertisement as a past economic model was also complicated, because there were certain issues that could not be touched, for instance, in terms of environment, contamination, or health issues of the readers and the public to you, which you were addressing. So I think this is the solution, is to have a truly independent, professional press, but also, as was said by my three colleagues, is a press that goes further into investigative journalism, that systematizes a deeper and more profound look at issues. That doesn't necessarily have to mean longer pieces of information, but it has to be deeper pieces of information in terms of the idea of finding out what's really behind the scenes and what happened. Because information is all around us all the time, especially in this internet world. We can read gossip, we can read Facebook, we can read many of these things, but it's not in the systematized professional way that you find the ideas that have been compiled by a journalist that does investigative journalism and explains it to the broad public. And I think this is the crucial element. I truly believe it's never going to go beyond that. Now, two quick ideas in terms of the economic model. You have mentioned it, Sally, as well. I think there will be challenges on how to have collective forms of cooperative journalism, of self-help forms, of structures, of new funding for journalism in different ways. All these challenges are difficult at this moment, but ultimately will support this independence that journalism should have. And finally, one word of caution. Journalists have to become very savvy in terms of technology, which they are. A journalist today has to do investigation, research, be a reporter, be a photographer, be an editor, and then publish. I mean, you have to do a multitasking issue. I know that. But the one thing that people will discover with the technology is that all of a sudden technology may be trying to take over the information gap. And this is very problematic. For instance, one of the challenges we have today, and here I speak as ex-rapporteur on freedom of expression, is the fact that you have the big platforms, internet platforms, trying to define themselves how they self-censor the content. This is a very problematic phenomenon, because on one hand, you don't want governments to establish content, but on the other hand, no one is really sure that you want the platforms themselves, which are a business model in themselves, to be the ones that self-defined contents, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And this is one of the debates that has been going on in Congress with Facebook, for instance. So I think this is a truly important moment to begin looking at this. And finally, with artificial intelligence, many people are talking about the fact that many professions may disappear, including journalism, because pretty soon you'll have a robotics machine being able to compile information, systematize it, and present it to the public. I don't think that's possible, by the way. The same way that I don't think you can have a judge, which is another of those crazy ideas. You cannot have a judge be judiciary authority being supplanted by a machine with artificial intelligence. There has to be a human touch to the way that information is dealt with. And I think journalism will always be a human activity, and there's no other way to it. But there are challenges in front of us that we should be discussing and looking at from an ethical point of view, and even from a regulatory and standards point of view in the future.
Thank you, Frank. I wanted to toss out actually 3 questions since we only have 10 or 15 minutes left and we have a lot of questions. So let me toss them out and then perhaps you can take them one by one. Andrea, the question was also to you in that how at the local level can you try to increase your credibility with readers and with government sources when you have a national climate and national politicians who are attacking journalists and attacking credibility. I wanted to also ask a question from Omar at San Francisco State University. His question is for Christina. I'm curious as to what precautions and measures investigative journalists in Brazil are taking. An alternative question is what risks come, you discussed this a bit, what risks come with investigative reporting in Brazil? And then there was a really interesting question for Sandra from Tori at the University of Miami. How has the territorial status of Puerto Rico impacted your First Amendment challenge against Puerto Rico's 2 fake news laws and other similar lawsuits and freedom of expression challenges? Here's a question for you. Would this situation change under US statehood? So I'm gonna let you go last. You think about how to answer that one. Andrea, why don't you go first?
Yes. So how to increase credibility from a local level? I think local journalism, so the rules for local, state, international, investigative, I think the rules for journalism apply at all levels. So what we've been saying until now, like the concept of transparency and independency are key to ensure that our readers are reading us, or are trusting our information. And it doesn't, I don't think, in my opinion, it doesn't matter at what level are we informing, if it's a national level or if it's just the neighborhood paper. But as a journalist, we always have to keep in mind that we are a public service and that our readers, like, is their right to have a transparent, independent and true story. So I think the way that we create credibility, the way that we reinforce credibility at the local level is by asking questions that other journalists won't ask, because like local stories are maybe not in their target. So we have the power of going to the local administration, we have the power of going to the local companies and ask those questions that journalists at the higher level are not gonna maybe pay attention, because they need to cover broader topics. Also, for example, in Kepasa's case, what has been happening these past months, the Latino community, and I go back to the Latino community and Hispanic community in North Carolina, there's always been disparities in healthcare access, in education access, in the job rights. So those disparities were always there, and there were only few media that were covering. There were only few occasions when we were paying attention to those disparities. What happened with the pandemic is that those disparities have been like in the front line of the informations, and thanks to the local media, they've been we've been opened the door to these disparities. We've been putting them on the table and saying, like, this is happening here, and so bigger media have put an eye on those problems, and the topic has become more broader.
And that's a tremendous public service. Latino media has a history of being very close to its community. And so I know you have high credibility in your community. But it's interesting to link with more general market media to reach the wider political system, right? Because in some ways you must affect the wider political system. But thank you for that. Thank you so much. I wish we could talk about these for a lot longer. Christina, I know you all are, you have training programs. You work on, for example, digital security. But maybe you could respond more broadly to Omar's question. How are journalists, investigative journalists in Brazil, protecting themselves? What precautions are you taking? What are you learning about how to do that?
Yeah, well, I think it's not only digital security that we have to worry about the investigative reporters in Brazil, also with physical security. So one friend of mine, he was at the Abrages board last year, Leandro De Moria, he works for the Intercept Brazil, and he has a bodyguard. So I think all these attacks that we are suffering and all this discredit that these attacks are trying to impose to journalists in a way, we have to take care of our social media, of our physical integrity, and also about our health. We have to think about our mental health as well, because being harassed every day, every time, so we have to go on therapy, or because we cannot go to the bar anymore until we have a vaccine to the pandemic. So no beers with friends, but maybe speaking with friends, exchanging experiences, having groups to discuss all this. I think it's very important. But for investigative journalists, I think they have an additional thing to worry about, is because they are digging in, into stories or subjects that others they're not doing it. So they have to be very careful with their sources as well. And take care of the subject I mentioned before, all the legal pressure that we are suffering nowadays. So the more you dig in, the more you go deeper. For instance, if you investigate all the things that the federal government in Brazil had to buy, personal security equipment, ventilators and others. If you go there and you point out and say, you didn't spend well the money, or the indigenous people are not getting all the help they need because you didn't spend well the money, so the government will come after you in a way. So all this, all the journalism, the investigative journalists, they had to look all this environment and try to protect themselves.
I'm really, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of mental well-being and self-care. It's squarely on the agenda for journalists, journalist associations, journalism schools, right? Unfortunately, journalism has become a high-risk occupation in many cases. So it really needs to be on the agenda, and media companies need to be more responsible about that, in my humble opinion as well. The last question was for Sandra. How has Puerto Rico's Commonwealth status impacted the First Amendment challenge? And I'll let you decide if you want to talk about statehood or not, because I know for Puerto Ricans, that's a tough question.
And we're having an election in 2 weeks regarding that particular subject as well. So be very careful with that. But just to add something to what Cristina just mentioned about harassment against journalists, I do agree with her. Journalists, and I have seen all throughout Latin America and also in Puerto Rico that usually journalists that are doing the good investigations, and the journalists that are basically after the right stories tend to be more harassed, tend to be more attacked. I remember when I started asking questions about the people who had died after the hurricane and making the tough questions, and I could see a parallel when I started making questions and when the harassment started, when they broke into my house, when they started disseminating information about myself and against other journalists in Puerto Rico, particularly women, and also women of color as well. So they tend to go and focus on that. Just to give you an example, today I just had to put a statement out on my social media because one of the political parties is basically throwing their social media trolls to attack myself and other reporters as well. So that happens across the board from different political organizations. And we have to work in clusters and work together and support each other, even if we're independent because of that. And in case of the laws that we're challenging, which is part of the environment that is being created here in Puerto Rico, let me just say first that the laws, those are two laws that were several laws that were enacted by the former governor, who's a pro-statehood governor, and his follower as well. And this particular law criminalizes what they call our false statements about emergencies, including the pandemic. So if they think that something that we print and put out is considered fake news, they can go against against you and your organization, and you can in a criminal prosecute you criminally. That's what they're doing to create an environment of intimidation and to basically chill the possible sources that journalists may have. So we have to do what we have always done in journalism, fight against that and provide the information and look for credible sources and provide the documents and put them out there. So I do, if about the question, if that's going to have a change with statehood, I don't know. I mean, there's going to be an election about that, but nothing is going to happen. It has to be binding by the United States, and the US government basically is not interested in that. So that's out of the question at this moment, I would say.
It is an interesting situation, though, that the national government of Puerto Rico can pass laws that are then disqualified by the First Amendment. So I'll be interested to see what happens to your case. I want to thank everybody. We're over time. I was just told that all of the questions that were asked, I can have those and forward them to you. I want to also encourage those who ask questions that unfortunately we couldn't get to reach out to you. And if you're so generous, you can respond to them. But for now, I just want to thank everyone again for the work you're doing and for sharing it with us today. It's important to get the word out. It's important that universities take this into account when we're educating students and asking them to get involved in what is now a sphere of protection or a human rights area that focus on the work of journalism. Because as so many of you said, journalists are being attacked because democracy is being eroded. And we need to defend journalism and we need to defend democracy. So, and we also need to protect public health on top of all of it. So I really, really do appreciate all of your time. I want to thank the audience. Fabulous questions. And I hope this is just the beginning of a great relationship with Fundamedios and that we continue these talks. We think about how we want to move forward from here as well. So let's stay in touch. Thank you for a great night and stay safe and reach out to us if we can help you in some way. Okay. Good night, everyone. And thank you.
Thank you,
Miami,
Sally, and
from
thank all the
Brazil,
colleagues.
from North Carolina, and from Puerto Rico. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.